Cowboy's stolen prayer. Josephine Josie Carter had sworn never to trust a man again, but when she found herself stranded with Rhett Tate, a gunfighter with nothing left to lose, she had no choice. He sat by the fire, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 1. The Broken Wheel and the Barren Road. The sun beat down on Josephine Josie Carter's back with the merciless intensity of a blacksmith's forge. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, dampening the already dusty fabric of her worn calico dress. Her hands, calloused from years of ranch work, gripped the rough wood of the wagon wheel, the splinters digging into her palms a familiar, almost comforting pain compared to the throbbing ache in her heart. The wheel, fractured nearly in two by a treacherous rock hidden in the tall prairie grass, lay defeated on the parched earth. It was a mirror of her own spirit, broken and seemingly beyond repair. Around her, the vastness of the Texas plains stretched to the horizon, an endless ocean of swaying grass under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air, thick with the scent of dry earth and the faint, sweet aroma of distant wildflowers, did little to soothe the knot of despair tightening in her chest. This was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start, far away from the shadowed memories of her life in Abilene, a life she had desperately tried to outrun. But now, stranded miles from anywhere, with a broken wagon and a dwindling supply of water, the past seemed to be catching up with her, its long, grasping fingers reaching out from the dust devils dancing on the horizon. She kicked at the offending wheel, a surge of frustration momentarily overcoming her despair. "Damn fool rock," she muttered, her voice raspy from thirst and suppressed tears. She knew it wasn't the rock's fault, nor the wheel's. It was her own foolish hope, her naive belief that she could simply pack up her life, her grief, and her shattered trust, and drive away from it all. Josie sank to the ground, the weight of her predicament pressing down on her like the relentless Texas sun. She closed her eyes, her mind conjuring the image of her late husband, Thomas. His laughing face, the warmth of his hand in hers, the easy way he had with the horses. It was a phantom limb, a constant, dull ache that reminded her of what she had lost. And then, the other memories, darker, sharper, edged with betrayal and the cold, hard realization that the man she had loved had been living a lie that had cost him his life, and her everything. A flicker of movement in the distance caught her eye. A lone rider, silhouetted against the setting sun, was approaching slowly. Her heart quickened, a mixture of hope and fear churning in her stomach. Help, perhaps? Or another danger, another layer of complication in a life already riddled with them? She stood, brushing the dust from her skirt, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, worn pistol tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden beneath the folds of fabric. It was a lady's gun, a derringer, small enough to conceal but powerful enough to offer a semblance of protection. It was a gift from her father, a tacit acknowledgement of the dangers a woman alone faced in this unforgiving land. The rider drew closer, resolving from a distant blur into a distinct figure. Tall, lean, and weathered, he sat astride a magnificent chestnut mare, its coat gleaming like polished copper in the fading light. He wore the garb of a working cowboy, dusty boots, worn leather chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. But there was something else, something in the way he held himself, in the set of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze, that hinted at a life lived beyond the confines of a cattle ranch. A gunfighter, perhaps. Or worse. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, the animal snorting and pawing at the ground, its breath clouding the air. He didn't speak, didn't dismount, just sat there, studying her with an unnerving stillness. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, seemed to pierce through her, stripping away her defenses, seeing the fear and the weariness she tried so hard to conceal. Josie swallowed, her throat dry. "Afternoon," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Trouble with the wheel, I see." The rider was the first to speak, his voice a low rumble, roughened by the elements, and perhaps something more. He dismounted with fluid grace, his movements economical and precise, like a predator conserving energy. "It is," Josie replied, her hand still hovering near her hidden pistol. He walked towards the broken wheel, his spurs clicking softly on the hard-packed earth. He knelt, running a calloused hand along the splintered wood, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Clean break. Can't be fixed, not out here." He looked up at her, his eyes catching the last rays of the setting sun. "You alone?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Josie hesitated, her mind racing. To admit her vulnerability was to invite danger, but to lie might be even more perilous. "I am," she finally answered, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. The man stood, his gaze unwavering. "Name's Rhett Tate," he said, extending a hand. His hand was large, rough, and warm, engulfing hers in a brief, surprisingly reassuring clasp. Josie hesitated, then took it, her own hand feeling small and fragile in his. "Josephine Carter." "Josie." "Josie," he repeated, his voice softening slightly. He released her hand, but his gaze lingered on her face. "You're a long way from anywhere, Josie Carter. And it's getting dark." He was stating the obvious, but the underlying meaning was clear. She was stranded, alone, and vulnerable. And he was offering what? Help? Or something else entirely? She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, any hint of malice. But his expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He gestured towards the setting sun, now a fiery ball sinking below the horizon. "Got a camp set up a few miles from here," he said. "Enough food and water to share. Safer than staying out here alone." Josie's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Trust a stranger? A gunfighter? By the looks of him? A man who exuded an aura of danger as palpable as the heat radiating from the sun-baked earth? It went against every instinct, every lesson she had learned in her 38 years. But the alternative, spending the night alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, with a broken wagon and dwindling supplies, was equally terrifying. She looked at the broken wheel, then back at Rhett Tate, his silhouette stark against the darkening sky. His offer was a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in a desperate situation. But accepting it meant placing her trust in a stranger, a man who carried the scent of gunpowder and the shadow of a past she couldn't even begin to imagine. He sat by the fire, the one he started moments ago, watching her, his voice low. "You're scared of me," he murmured. "Smart girl. But fear won't keep you warm tonight." Chapter 2. A stranger's offer in the dying light. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on Rhett Tate's face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the deep lines etched around his eyes. Those eyes, now reflecting the firelight, held a mixture of weariness and something else, a guardedness, perhaps, or a sadness that lingered just beneath the surface. He had built the fire with an efficiency that spoke of long practice, coaxing flames from dry twigs and branches with the ease of a man accustomed to relying on his own resourcefulness. Josie sat across from him, wrapped in a thick, woolen blanket he had retrieved from his saddlebags. The blanket smelled faintly of horse sweat and wood smoke, a strangely comforting aroma that grounded her in the present moment. She had reluctantly accepted his offer, her fear warring with a growing sense of not trust, not yet, but a cautious acceptance of her dependence on this stranger. The night air, though still warm, carried a distinct chill, a reminder of the vulnerability of being alone in the vast, open plains. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hugged the blanket tighter around herself, grateful for its warmth. "For the fire and the blanket." Rhett nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Don't mention it. No place for a woman to be alone, especially with night coming on." His words, though simple, carried a weight of unspoken meaning. He knew, as she did, the dangers that lurked in the darkness, both human and animal. Coyotes howled in the distance, their mournful cries echoing across the plains, a chilling reminder of the wildness that surrounded them. Josie studied him covertly, trying to decipher the man behind the stoic facade. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, but his face bore the marks of a life lived hard. A jagged scar traced a line across his left cheekbone, disappearing beneath the shadow of his hat. His hands, strong and calloused, were never still, constantly fiddling with a small, smooth stone he had picked up from the ground. "What brings you out this way?" she asked, breaking the silence. She needed to know more, to understand the risk she was taking by accepting his help. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. "Passing through," he said, his voice noncommittal. "Heading west." "West?" Josie echoed. "To where?" He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. "Wherever the wind takes me, I suppose." His answer was evasive, unsatisfying. It told her nothing about his past, his intentions, or his reasons for being out here in the middle of nowhere. He was a closed book, a man who guarded his secrets as carefully as he guarded his life. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "What brings a woman like you out this way, all alone?" Josie hesitated, her heart tightening. She wasn't ready to share her story, not with this stranger, not with anyone. The wounds were still too raw, the memories too painful. "I'm relocating," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Starting over." "Starting over," he repeated, his voice low and thoughtful. He seemed to understand, to recognize the unspoken pain behind her words. "That's a hard thing to do." "It is," Josie agreed, her voice choked with emotion. She looked away, staring into the fire, the flames blurring through a sudden film of tears. He didn't press her, didn't pry into her past. He simply sat there, a silent, watchful presence, offering a quiet companionship that was surprisingly comforting. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin plate and a couple of tin cups. He poured coffee from a blackened pot that had been nestled amongst the embers, the rich aroma filling the air. "Coffee?" he offered, holding out a cup towards her. Josie took it, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice husky. They drank in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire, the distant howls of coyotes, and the occasional soft sigh of the wind rustling through the tall grass. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. As the night deepened, the stars emerged, a breathtaking tapestry of light scattered across the vast, inky sky. Josie had never seen so many stars, so bright and clear, unobscured by the smoke and haze of city life. It was a humbling sight, a reminder of the immensity of the universe and the insignificance of her own troubles. Rhett pointed to a constellation, a cluster of stars forming a distinct pattern. "The Seven Sisters," he said. "Some folks call them the Pleiades." Josie followed his gaze, marveling at the beauty of the night sky. She knew nothing about constellations, about the names and stories behind the stars. Her life had been confined to the practicalities of running a ranch, of managing household affairs, of navigating the complexities of a marriage that had ultimately proven to be a lie. "They're beautiful," she said softly. He nodded. "My mother used to tell me stories about them," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "Said they were daughters of Atlas, fleeing from a hunter." It was the first personal detail he had revealed, a glimpse into a past that was clearly etched with both love and loss. Josie sensed a vulnerability in him, a crack in the armor of his stoicism. "Do you believe those stories?" she asked, curious. He shrugged. "Don't know, but it's comforting, somehow, to think there's something more out there. Something beyond the hardship and the heartbreak." His words resonated with her, echoing her own longing for something beyond the pain and disappointment of her past. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just a gunfighter, a stranger, but a man who carried his own burdens, his own sorrows. He met her gaze, his eyes holding hers in the firelight. There was a connection there, a spark of understanding that transcended their differences, their fears, and their guardedness. It was a fragile connection, tentative and uncertain, but it was there, nonetheless. What will you do now? He finally asked the question that had no good answer. With your wagon. How will you get to wherever you were going? Josie's stomach felt hollow again, the brief respite from her problems quickly vanishing. She'd been so caught up in the moment, in the surprising comfort of this stranger's presence, she had almost forgotten the dire circumstances she was in. Her gaze drifted out past the glow of the fire, into the deep ink of the surrounding prairie. A vast, unforgiving land, swallowing her whole. Chapter 3. Embers of Distrust and Flickers of Hope. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, like the smoke from the dying fire. Josie wrapped her arms around herself, the woolen blanket offering little comfort against the sudden chill that had crept into her bones. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with renewed force. The broken wagon, the empty plains, the vast distance to anywhere. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The truth was, she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her plan, if it could even be called that, had been to simply escape, to put as much distance as possible between herself and Abilene. The details, the logistics, had seemed insignificant compared to the overwhelming need to flee. Rhett remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flickering embers. He seemed to be considering her predicament, weighing her options with the same careful deliberation he had shown in assessing the broken wheel. There's a town, Harmony Springs, he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. About 2 days' ride from here, due west. Small place, but they've got a blacksmith, a livery stable might be able to get your wagon fixed there. 2 days. It sounded like an eternity. 2 days of walking under the relentless sun, with limited water and the constant threat of danger. 2 days of relying on this stranger, a man she barely knew, a man who carried a gun and an air of mystery that both intrigued and terrified her. 2 days, she repeated, her voice tinged with doubt. I don't know if I can make it. He looked at her, his whiskey-colored eyes searching hers. You can, he said, his voice firm and surprisingly reassuring. You're stronger than you think. His words, simple as they were, struck a chord within her. He saw strength in her, a resilience she hadn't even realized she possessed. It was a flicker of hope in the darkness of her despair, a spark of encouragement that warmed her from the inside out. But the wagon, she said, gesturing towards the disabled vehicle. I can't just leave it here. It contained everything she owned, the few meager possessions she had managed to salvage from her shattered life. We'll come back for it, he said. Once you're settled in Harmony Springs, we can figure out how to get it hauled in. We. The word, so casually spoken, sent a shiver down her spine. It implied a partnership, a shared responsibility, a level of trust she wasn't sure she was ready for. But she had no choice. She was at his mercy, dependent on his generosity and his willingness to help. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice choked with emotion. He shrugged, dismissing her gratitude with a wave of his hand. No need for thanks. Just doing what anyone would do. But Josie knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stopped for a stranded woman, alone in the middle of nowhere. Not everyone would have offered their help, their protection, without expecting something in return. There was a decency in him, a quiet nobility that belied his rough exterior and the dangerous aura that surrounded him. He stood up, stretching his long limbs, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his lean frame. Best get some sleep, he said. Long ride ahead of us tomorrow. He unrolled his bedroll a few feet from the fire, offering her a space closer to the warmth. Josie hesitated, her ingrained sense of propriety warring with her exhaustion and the growing sense of safety. She realized with a jolt that she felt in his presence. Are you sure? She asked, her voice uncertain. Positive, he replied, his voice gentle. You need your rest. She lay down, wrapped in the woolen blanket, her body aching from the day's ordeal. The ground was hard and uneven, but she was too tired to care. She closed her eyes, listening to the crackling embers, the distant howls of coyotes, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man lying a few feet away. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Her mind raced, replaying the day's events, questioning her decision to trust this stranger. What if he was lying? What if he had ulterior motives? What if he was leading her into a trap? She glanced at him, his silhouette outlined against the dying fire. He lay on his back, his face turned towards the stars, his breathing deep and even. He looked peaceful, almost vulnerable in sleep. But Josie knew that appearances could be deceiving. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The memory of Thomas, her late husband, surfaced unbidden, bringing with it a wave of grief and anger. His handsome face, his charming smile, his easy laughter, all masks, hiding a dark secret, a double life that had ultimately cost him his life. She had trusted him, loved him, believed in him, and he had betrayed her in the most profound way possible. The pain of that betrayal was still raw, a gaping wound in her heart. It had shattered her faith in men, in love, in the very idea of trust. And now, here she was, placing her life in the hands of another stranger, a man who carried a gun and a past as shrouded in mystery as the night sky. Was she making the same mistake again? Was she setting herself up for another heartbreak, another betrayal? The questions haunted her, swirling in her mind like the dust devils she had seen on the horizon. But amidst the fear and the doubt, there was a flicker of something else. A glimmer of hope, perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to give up. She had survived so much, endured so much pain. She wouldn't let fear paralyze her. She would face whatever came her way with courage and determination. She would not let the past break her. She closed her eyes again, willing herself to sleep. The embers of the fire glowed, casting a faint warmth on her face. Embers of distrust still burned within her, but alongside them, a tiny spark of hope began to flicker, fueled by the unexpected kindness of a stranger and the unyielding spirit of a woman who had learned to survive. She had been so focused on leaving, she hadn't seen what was right next to her. A rifle, tucked beside her bedroll, close enough to grab. She hadn't noticed it before, and it brought the fear back full force. Chapter 4. Whispers of a past she cannot outrun. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and gold, chasing away the shadows of the night. Josie awoke with a start, her heart pounding, the image of the rifle still vivid in her mind. She sat up, clutching the woolen blanket around her, her gaze darting towards Rhett. He was already awake, sitting by the rekindled fire, his back to her. He was cleaning the rifle, his movements practiced and efficient. The sight of the weapon, no longer tucked away, but now held openly, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. He glanced over his shoulder, noticing her movement. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and even. He didn't seem surprised to see her staring at the rifle. "Morning," Josie replied, her voice still thick with sleep and apprehension. She tried to keep her tone neutral, but she couldn't quite mask the tremor of unease that ran through her. He finished cleaning the rifle, then carefully placed it back in its scabbard, attached to his saddle. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sleep well?" he asked. Josie hesitated. "As well as could be expected," she said, choosing her words carefully. She wasn't about to reveal her fear, her doubts, not yet. He nodded, as if understanding her unspoken reservations. He poured her a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. "We should get moving soon," he said. "Long ride ahead of us." Josie accepted the coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. She took a sip, the hot liquid warming her from the inside out, but it did little to calm the turmoil within her. She needed to know more about this man, about the rifle, about the dangers he seemed to anticipate. "That's quite a weapon," she said, trying to sound casual, as if she were merely making conversation. He followed her gaze, his eyes settling on the rifle. "It is," he agreed. "Necessary out here." "Necessary for what?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He met her gaze, his eyes holding hers. "Protection," he said simply. "From whatever might come our way." His answer was vague, unsatisfying. It told her nothing about the specific threats he anticipated, the reasons he felt the need to carry such a powerful weapon. It only reinforced her sense of unease, her growing suspicion that he was hiding something. They ate a quick breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, the silence between them punctuated only by the sounds of their chewing and the chirping of birds greeting the new day. Josie watched him covertly, studying his every move, searching for any clue that might reveal his true nature. As they packed up their meager belongings, Josie's thoughts drifted back to Abilene, to the life she had left behind. She had tried to bury the memories, to outrun the pain, but they were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, ready to resurface at the slightest trigger. The image of her husband's lifeless body, lying in a pool of blood in the dusty street outside the saloon, flashed before her eyes. The shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming grief, it had all been too much to bear. And then, the whispers had started. Whispers about his gambling debts, his involvement with outlaws, his secret life that she had known nothing about. The townspeople, once friendly and supportive, had turned their backs on her, their eyes filled with suspicion and pity. She had become an outcast, a pariah, tainted by her husband's sins. The whispers had followed her everywhere, like a relentless shadow, driving her to the brink of despair. He owed money to the wrong people, the sheriff had told her, his voice gruff but not unkind. A dangerous bunch, Josie. Best you leave town, for your own safety. She had heeded his advice, packing her few belongings, selling the ranch for a pittance, and setting out on a journey with no clear destination, driven only by the desperate need to escape the whispers and the suffocating weight of her past. But the past, she was learning, was not so easily outrun. It clung to her like the dust on her clothes, like the scent of gunpowder that clung to Rhett Tate. It was a constant reminder of her loss, her betrayal, and the fragility of trust. Ready? Rhett's voice broke through her reverie, pulling her back to the present. Josie nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ready, she said, her voice betraying a hint of the turmoil she felt inside. She knew where they needed to go, what they were to retrieve, but the thought of returning to the broken wagon did nothing to ease the tension in her stomach. It was a tangible, undeniable reminder of what she had lost, of the future she had planned that was now broken beyond repair. Would facing that wagon break her, or reinforce what Rhett seemed to think? That she was stronger than she knew? She glanced at Rhett, and found his deep, unreadable eyes already on her. Chapter 5. The weight of a gunfighter's gaze. His gaze was intense, unwavering, a silent scrutiny that seemed to penetrate the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. Josie shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze, feeling exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see the turmoil raging beneath her calm exterior. She had spent years perfecting the art of hiding her emotions, of presenting a facade of strength and composure to the world, but with Rhett Tate, it felt as though those defenses were crumbling. They rode in silence for most of the morning, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the dry earth, the creak of leather saddles, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape was vast and unchanging, an endless expanse of rolling hills and swaying prairie grass, broken only by the occasional cluster of rocks or a lone, gnarled tree. The sun beat down relentlessly, the heat shimmering in waves above the ground, making the air feel thick and heavy. Josie tried to focus on the present, on the journey ahead, but her mind kept drifting back to the past, to the unanswered questions that haunted her. Who were the wrong people her husband had owed money to? What were their intentions? Were they still looking for her? Was Rhett Tate somehow connected to them? The thought sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She stole a glance at him, riding beside her, his profile stark against the bright blue sky. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed but alert, his hand never far from the rifle strapped to his horse. He was a formidable presence, a man who exuded both strength and danger, a man who could protect her or betray her. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that there was more to him than met the eye. His evasiveness, his reluctance to talk about his past, his constant vigilance, it all added up to a sense of unease that she couldn't ignore. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and gentle, but it still startled her. Josie hesitated, unsure how to respond. She didn't want to reveal her suspicions, her fears, But she also didn't want to lie. Just thinking, she said finally, choosing her words carefully. About what? He asked, his eyes meeting hers. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. About everything, she said, her voice vague and evasive. He didn't press her, didn't pry into her thoughts. He simply nodded, accepting her answer, or perhaps choosing to ignore her reluctance to confide in him. They rode on, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with unspoken questions and simmering doubts. Josie's mind continued to race, replaying the events of the past few days, searching for any clue, any sign that might reveal Rhett Tate's true intentions. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became almost unbearable. Josie's throat was parched, her lips cracked, and her head began to pound. She longed for shade, for water, for a respite from the relentless sun. "We'll stop soon," Rhett said, as if reading her mind. "There's a creek up ahead, a small grove of trees. We can rest there for a while." His words were a welcome relief, a promise of a brief escape from the harsh elements. Josie nodded, her gratitude evident in her eyes. They reached the creek a short time later, a narrow ribbon of water winding its way through a cluster of cottonwood trees. The shade provided by the trees was a welcome sanctuary, the air noticeably cooler and fresher than the surrounding plains. Rhett dismounted, helping Josie down from her horse. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff and sore from the long ride. He steadied her with a firm hand, his touch sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. "Easy there," he said, his voice gentle. Josie pulled away, embarrassed by her momentary weakness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. He didn't seem offended by her brusqueness. He simply nodded, releasing her arm. He led the horses to the creek, allowing them to drink their fill. He then filled his canteen, offering it to Josie. She took it gratefully, drinking deeply of the cool, refreshing water. It was the best thing she had tasted in days. She closed her eyes, savoring the moment, the relief from the heat, the temporary escape from her worries. When she opened her eyes, she found Rhett watching her, his gaze intense and unwavering. The weight of that gaze was almost palpable, a physical force that seemed to press down on her. She felt a sudden urge to flee, to escape his scrutiny, to put as much distance as possible between them. But she couldn't. She was trapped, dependent on him, bound to him by circumstance and a growing sense of something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something more than fear. It was a complex mixture of apprehension, curiosity, and a reluctant, undeniable attraction. He took the canteen back, after filling a tin cup for her to have more. She accepted it without a word, eyes locked on his. They were a warm brown, but in the shadows of the trees, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of gold deep within them. He turned away first, breaking the locked gaze, and returned to tending the horses. It felt, for just the briefest of moments, like she'd won something. But what? Chapter 6. Scars beneath the surface, both seen and unseen. The silence of the shaded grove was broken only by the gentle murmur of the creek and the rustling of leaves in the cottonwood trees. Josie sat on a fallen log, sipping the last of the water from the tin cup, her gaze fixed on Rhett. He was tending to the horses, brushing their coats, checking their hooves, his movements efficient and practiced. He seemed to be deliberately avoiding her gaze, giving her space, allowing her time to gather her thoughts. Or perhaps, she thought, he was simply avoiding her questions, her probing eyes that sought to uncover the secrets he so carefully guarded. She studied him, noticing details she hadn't noticed before. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the way his muscles rippled beneath his worn shirt as he worked, the way his jaw tightened when he encountered a particularly stubborn knot in the horse's mane. He was a man of physical strength, that much was obvious, but there was also a gentleness in his touch, a care and concern for the animals that belied his rough exterior. And then there were the scars. The one on his cheekbone, she had noticed before, a jagged line that spoke of a violent encounter. But now, as he leaned over to check the horse's hooves, she saw another scar, partially hidden by his shirt sleeve. It was a long, thin scar, running from his wrist to his elbow, as if he had been cut by a knife or a sharp blade. Scars beneath the surface, both seen and unseen. That phrase, unbidden, popped into her mind. It described him perfectly, she realized. He was a man marked by his past, both physically and emotionally. A man who carried his wounds with a quiet stoicism, revealing little of the pain he had endured. And she, too, carried scars. Not the visible kind, like his, but deep, emotional wounds that had left their mark on her soul. The scar of her husband's betrayal, the scar of her lost trust, the scar of her shattered dreams. Scars that ached with a dull, persistent pain, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the inevitability of loss. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. What had he seen? What had he done? What had he lost? The questions swirled in her mind, a tangled web of curiosity and apprehension. He finished tending to the horses, then turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers across the small clearing. He seemed to be waiting for her to speak, to break the silence that had settled between them. "That scar," she said, her voice hesitant, gesturing towards his arm. "How did you get it?" He glanced down at his arm, as if surprised by her question. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then he pulled down his sleeve, concealing the scar from view. "It's an old wound," he said, his voice noncommittal. "Nothing to worry about." His evasiveness only fueled her curiosity. She wanted to know more, to understand the story behind the scar, the pain it represented. But she also sensed that she was treading on dangerous ground, that she was pushing him to reveal more than he was willing to share. "It looks like it was painful," she persisted, her voice softer now, less demanding. He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. "It was," he admitted. "But it's healed now." "Physically, perhaps," Josie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what about inside?" His eyes widened slightly, as if surprised by her perceptiveness. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since they had stopped at the creek. He seemed to be searching her face, trying to decipher her intentions, her motives. "We all carry scars, Josie," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "Seen and unseen. It's part of being human." His words resonated with her, echoing her own thoughts. She nodded, understanding his unspoken meaning. They were both wounded, both scarred by their pasts. And perhaps, in that shared vulnerability, there was a connection, a bond that transcended their differences and their fears. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small, smooth stone he had been fiddling with earlier. He held it out to her, offering it as a silent gesture of what? Friendship? Comfort? Understanding? Josie hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing against his. The stone was warm from his touch, smooth and cool against her palm. It was a simple object, but it felt significant, a tangible representation of the connection that was slowly forming between them. "It's a worry stone," he said, his voice soft. "My mother gave it to me. Said it helps to calm the mind, to ease the anxieties." Josie turned the stone over in her hand, feeling its smooth surface, its weight. She thought of her own anxieties, her own worries, the constant churn of fear and doubt that plagued her. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "I appreciate it." He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening his features, making him look younger, less guarded. It was a fleeting glimpse of the man beneath the scars, the man he might have been before life had marked him. And though Josie's own internal scars were still throbbing, aching to be healed, she suddenly felt a tiny flicker of hope start to grow, to get stronger. It was quickly overwhelmed by another emotion, though. The sound of distant hoofbeats had her blood running cold. Chapter 7. A shared meal under a sky full of secrets. The sound, faint but unmistakable, cut through the peaceful tranquility of the grove. Rhett's head snapped up, his eyes instantly alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the nearby tree. Josie's heart leaped into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. The worry stone, still clutched in her hand, suddenly felt heavy, a cold weight against her palm. "Riders," Rhett said, his voice low and urgent. "Coming fast." He didn't need to elaborate. Josie knew the implications. Out here, in the vast, unprotected plains, approaching riders could mean anything. Bandits, outlaws, or perhaps the men her husband had owed money to. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. "How many?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rhett squinted, his eyes scanning the horizon.
"Can't tell yet," he said.
"But they're moving fast. We need to get ready." He quickly gathered their belongings, his movements swift and efficient. He handed Josie her saddlebags, his eyes meeting hers.
"Stay close to me," he said.
"And do what I say." Josie nodded, her mind racing. She trusted him, she realized, with a sudden clarity that surprised her. Despite her initial doubts, despite her lingering fears, she trusted him to protect her. He had shown her nothing but kindness, consideration, and a quiet strength that reassured her. They mounted their horses, Rhett leading the way, his rifle now held ready in his hand. They rode out of the grove, back into the open plains, the sun beating down on them with relentless intensity. Josie kept her horse close to Rhett's, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, searching for any sign of the approaching riders. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Josie's heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweating. She could feel the tension radiating from Rhett, his body rigid, his senses on high alert. Finally, she saw them. A group of riders, perhaps 5 or 6, silhouetted against the horizon, coming towards them at a rapid pace. They were still too far away to make out any details, but their speed and their direction left little doubt that they were heading straight for them. "Get down," Rhett ordered, his voice sharp. He dismounted, pulling Josie down with him. He led the horses behind a cluster of rocks, providing a small measure of cover. Josie crouched beside him, her body trembling. She could feel the heat radiating from the rocks, the dryness of the air, the pounding of her own heart. She watched Rhett, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. He raised his rifle, taking aim. Josie's breath caught in her throat. Was he going to shoot? Was she about to witness a gunfight? The thought terrified her, but she also knew that he was doing what was necessary to protect them. The riders drew closer, their features becoming clearer. Josie could see that they were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered and hardened, their clothes dusty and worn. They carried rifles and pistols, their weapons glinting in the sunlight. Just when Josie thought Rhett was about to fire, he lowered his rifle slightly. He seemed to relax, his body losing some of its tension. "Hold your fire," a voice called out, a gruff, commanding tone. "We mean you no harm." Rhett hesitated, then slowly lowered his rifle completely. "Who are you?" he called back, his voice loud and clear. The lead rider, a tall, burly man with a thick, black beard, reined in his horse a few yards from them. "Name's Jedediah," he said. "We're just passing through. Saw your smoke, figured we'd stop and say hello." Josie's breath caught in her chest. Jedediah was a popular name, but it couldn't be. Could it? Rhett didn't seem convinced. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice still guarded. "What brings you out this way?" Jedediah shrugged. "Same as you, I reckon," he said. "Just trying to make our way in this world." His answer was vague, unsatisfying, but it seemed to appease Rhett. He slowly stood up, his rifle still in his hand, but no longer aimed. Josie followed suit, her legs still shaky. The riders dismounted, approaching them cautiously. They were a motley crew, their faces a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They looked at Josie, their eyes lingering on her, their expressions unreadable. Jedediah extended a hand to Rhett. "No hard feelings, I hope," he said. "We're just looking for some water. Our canteens are running low." Rhett hesitated, then shook Jedediah's hand.
"We've got some to spare," he said.
"Help yourselves." The riders gathered around the creek, drinking their fill, their horses splashing in the shallows. Josie watched them, her mind still reeling from the encounter. Had it been a coincidence? Or had they been deliberately seeking them out? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plains, Rhett built a small fire. He offered the riders some of his dried meat and hardtack, sharing what little food they had. It was a gesture of hospitality, a way of showing that they meant no harm, a way to defuse the situation. They ate together, a shared meal under a sky full of secrets. The riders, though still wary, seemed to relax somewhat, their conversation turning to tales of the trail, of hardships endured and dangers overcome. Josie listened, her mind still racing, her senses on high alert. Josie, quiet throughout it all, suddenly heard a name mentioned.
Clayton.
She froze. That was one of the names that had been whispered in Abilene. One of the men her husband had supposedly owed money to. And then she saw his face. Jedediah. Her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp. It was him. The same man who had given her the terrible news. The same man who warned her to leave town. She stole a glance at Rhett. He was looking, too, his eyes narrowed in warning, silently begging her to not reveal that she recognized anyone. Chapter 8. The Echoes of Laughter and the Shadow of Loss. Josie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of forced civility. She could feel Jedediah's eyes on her, a subtle but persistent scrutiny that sent shivers down her spine. He remembered her. She was sure of it. The way his gaze lingered, the slight furrow of his brow, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, it all betrayed a recognition that she had desperately hoped to avoid. She forced herself to maintain a calm exterior, to appear unfazed by his presence. She picked at her food, avoiding eye contact, pretending to be engrossed in the conversation of the other riders. But her mind was racing, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Why was he here? Was it a coincidence, as he had claimed? Or was it a deliberate act, a calculated move in a game she didn't understand? Was he still looking for the money her husband had owed? Was he a threat to her safety? She stole another glance at Rhett. He was sitting opposite her, his face impassive, his eyes fixed on Jedediah. He seemed to be aware of her distress, of the silent exchange that was taking place between her and the leader of the riders. He gave her a subtle nod, a silent reassurance that he was there, that he would protect her. But even his presence couldn't fully quell the fear that gnawed at her. She knew the dangers of the frontier, the ruthlessness of men like Jedediah. She had seen firsthand the consequences of crossing the wrong people, the devastating toll it could take. The conversation around the campfire drifted from tales of hardship to boasts of daring exploits, of gunfights won and fortunes made. Josie listened, her mind only half present, her thoughts consumed by the memories that Jedediah's presence had unearthed. She remembered the laughter, the carefree days before her husband's death, before the whispers had started. She remembered the warmth of his embrace, the sparkle in his eyes, the easy way he had with people. He had been a good man, she had believed, a loving husband, a respected member of the community. But then, the truth had emerged, shattering her illusions, leaving her with nothing but grief and the bitter taste of betrayal. He had been living a lie, a double life that she had known nothing about. He had gambled away their savings, borrowed money from dangerous men, and ultimately paid the price with his life. The memory of his lifeless body, lying in the dusty street, flashed before her eyes, bringing with it a fresh wave of pain. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "You all right, ma'am?" one of the riders asked, his voice breaking through her reverie. Josie opened her eyes, forcing a smile. "Just tired," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It's been a long day." The rider nodded, accepting her explanation. He offered her a piece of dried meat, a gesture of kindness that she appreciated. The evening wore on, the campfire burning low, casting long, dancing shadows on the faces of the men. The conversation gradually died down, replaced by a comfortable silence. The riders began to unroll their bedrolls, preparing for the night. Jedediah stood up, stretching his long limbs. He looked at Josie, his eyes lingering on her face. You sure you're all right, ma'am? He asked, his voice softer now, less gruff. You seem a bit pale. Josie's heart skipped a beat. He knew. He definitely knew. I'm fine, she said, her voice a little stronger this time.
Just a bit weary.
He nodded, but his eyes still held a hint of suspicion. Well, get some rest, he said. We'll be moving on at first light. He turned and walked away, joining his men. Josie watched him go, her mind still reeling. She didn't trust him, not one bit. She was convinced that he was hiding something, that he had ulterior motives. Rhett came over and sat beside her, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. He knows, he said, his voice low and quiet. He recognizes you. Josie nodded, her throat tight with fear. What do we do? She whispered.
We stick to the plan, he said.
We get to Harmony Springs. We get you settled. And then we deal with him if we have to. His words were reassuring, but they also carried a hint of danger. She knew that confronting Jedediah could be risky, even deadly. But she also knew that she couldn't run forever. She had to face her past, her fears, if she ever wanted to find peace. He rose, and, before turning away, offered her a comforting, reassuring smile. She returned one in kind, but it was weak. Her fear was too strong. She watched as Rhett drifted to his bedroll, and within moments, she could hear his gentle breathing. He was asleep.
How?
How could he sleep at a time like this? Chapter 9. A moment of vulnerability in the cold night air. Sleep evaded Josie. The cold night air seeped into her bones, chilling her despite the woolen blanket wrapped around her. The embers of the fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of the stars to illuminate the darkness. The sounds of the night, the rustling of the wind through the grass, the distant howls of coyotes, the soft snores of the sleeping men, all served to heighten her anxiety, to keep her on edge. She lay there, staring up at the vast, star-studded sky, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. Jedediah's presence had reopened old wounds, brought back the pain and the fear she had tried so hard to bury. She felt vulnerable, exposed, as if she were being hunted. She thought of Rhett, sleeping soundly a few feet away. His calm demeanor, his quiet strength, had been a source of comfort to her, a lifeline in the midst of her turmoil. But even his presence couldn't fully quell the fear that gnawed at her. She was alone, ultimately, responsible for her own safety, her own survival. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the smooth, cool surface of the worry stone Rhett had given her. She rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger, seeking a sense of calm, a moment of peace. But the stone offered little solace. Her worries were too big, too overwhelming, to be soothed by a simple object. A sudden noise, a twig snapping nearby, startled her. She sat up, her heart pounding, her eyes searching the darkness. She saw a figure approaching, tall and silhouetted against the faint starlight. It was Rhett. He knelt beside her, his face barely visible in the darkness. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice a low whisper. Josie shook her head, her throat tight with emotion. No, she whispered back. Too much on my mind. He nodded, understanding. He sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort, but his presence was a comfort in itself. He knows, she said finally, breaking the silence. Jedediah, he knows who I am. I know, Rhett said, his voice calm and reassuring. But he won't do anything here. Not with his men around. Not in the open. His words offered a small measure of relief, but they didn't erase her fear. She knew that Jedediah was a dangerous man, capable of anything. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the ruthlessness that lay beneath his veneer of civility. What if he follows us? She asked, her voice trembling. What if he tries to hurt me? Rhett reached out, his hand gently covering hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, sending a jolt of unexpected comfort through her. I won't let him, he said, his voice firm and resolute. I promise you, Josie. I won't let him harm you. His words, his touch, His unwavering gaze, it all broke through her defenses, crumbling the walls she had built around her heart. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another and another. She couldn't hold back the sobs that racked her body, the pent-up emotions that she had been suppressing for so long. Red didn't try to stop her. He simply held her hand, his presence a silent anchor in the midst of her storm. He let her cry, letting out all the grief, the fear, the pain that she had been carrying for so long. It was a moment of vulnerability, a raw and honest expression of her deepest emotions. She had never allowed herself to be this vulnerable with anyone, not even with her late husband. She had always felt the need to be strong, to be in control, to hide her weaknesses from the world. But with Rhett, she felt safe, protected, as if she could finally let go, finally allow herself to feel the pain without judgment, without fear. He was a stranger, yes, but he was also a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the rough and unpredictable road of life. As her sobs subsided, she wiped her eyes, embarrassed by her outburst. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to. Don't apologize," Rhett said, his voice gentle. "You have nothing to be sorry for." He released her hand, but the warmth of his touch lingered. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a compassion and understanding that she had rarely encountered. "It's all right to be scared, Josie," he said. "It's all right to be vulnerable. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." His words resonated with her, echoing the thoughts she had had earlier when they had talked about scars. They were both wounded, both scarred by their pasts. But their wounds didn't define them. They were survivors, fighters, capable of overcoming adversity, of finding strength in the midst of pain. He stood, ready to return to his bedroll. But before he did, he looked down at Josie one more time. "Try to get some sleep," he said. He paused. "We'll be in Harmony Springs soon. You'll be safe there." Josie looked up at him, a wave of questions flooding her mind. But they could wait. For now, she simply took a deep, steadying breath. Chapter 10. The unspoken bond forged in desperation. The dawn arrived, painting the sky in hues of gray and muted orange, a stark contrast to the fiery sunsets Josie had become accustomed to. The air was still and heavy, carrying a hint of moisture, a promise of a change in the weather. Jedediah and his men were already awake, packing their belongings, their movements quick and efficient. They seemed eager to be on their way, to put distance between themselves and the encounter of the previous night. Josie watched them, her stomach churning with a mixture of fear and relief. She was glad to see them go, to be rid of Jedediah's unsettling presence, but she also knew that this wasn't the end of it. He knew who she was, and he would likely be back, seeking whatever it was he believed she possessed. Rhett, ever vigilant, stood beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. He didn't speak, but his presence was a reassurance, a silent promise of protection. He had shown her, in the quiet hours of the night, a vulnerability that mirrored her own, forging a bond between them that transcended their circumstances, their fears, and their vastly different pasts. Jedediah approached them, his face impassive, his eyes guarded. "We're heading out," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Thanks for the water and the company." Rhett nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Safe travels," he said, his voice neutral. Jedediah hesitated, his eyes lingering on Josie. "You take care of yourself, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, almost concerned. Josie forced a smile, trying to appear unfazed by his words. "I will," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded, then turned and mounted his horse. He gave a signal to his men, and they rode off, disappearing into the vastness of the plains, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a lingering sense of unease. Josie watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sense of relief, but it was tempered by a nagging fear, a premonition that this wasn't over, that she hadn't seen the last of Jedediah. "They're gone," Rhett said, his voice breaking through her thoughts.
"For now."
Josie nodded, unable to shake the feeling of impending doom. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We keep going," he said. We get to Harmony Springs. We get you settled. And then we figure out what to do about Jedediah. His words were reassuring, but they also carried a weight of responsibility. He was taking on her burden, her problems, as if they were his own. He was risking his own safety, his own well-being, to help her, a woman he barely knew.
Why?
She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why are you doing this, Rhett? Why are you helping me? He looked at her, his whiskey-colored eyes searching hers. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words, to express the emotions that lay beneath his stoic exterior. Because he started, then hesitated. Because no one should have to face this alone. Because you remind me of someone I once knew. Someone I failed to protect. His words, his voice, his expression, it all revealed a depth of pain, a hidden wound that he carried with him, a burden of guilt and regret. He saw in her a reflection of his own past, a chance to redeem himself, to make amends for a mistake he couldn't undo. Josie understood. She saw in him a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the road of loss and redemption. They were both wounded, both seeking solace, both searching for a way to heal. Thank you, she said, her voice choked with emotion. For everything. He nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips.
Let's get going, he said.
We've got a long ride ahead of us. They mounted their horses, setting off towards Harmony Springs, the rising sun at their backs. The unspoken bond between them, forged in desperation and strengthened by shared vulnerability, was a silent promise, a mutual understanding that they would face whatever came their way, together. The air was tense, hanging as heavy as the silence between them. Josie had no idea what they would face in Harmony Springs, but for the first time since leaving Abilene, she didn't feel entirely alone. And as they approached a familiar break in the landscape, she knew their first challenge was at hand. There, slumped against the unforgiving earth, was her wagon. Chapter 11. Ghosts of Promises and the Sting of Betrayal. The sight of the wagon, a forlorn and broken silhouette against the vast prairie, hit Josie harder than she expected. It was more than just a disabled vehicle, it was a tangible representation of her shattered hopes, a stark reminder of the life she had lost, the future she had planned that was now irrevocably broken. It stood there, tilted awkwardly to one side, the fractured wheel a gaping wound in its wooden frame. The canvas cover, once pristine and white, was now torn and stained with dust, flapping listlessly in the breeze. The contents, the meager possessions she had managed to salvage from her old life, were scattered around the wagon bed, exposed to the elements and the prying eyes of any passing creature. Josie felt a lump form in her throat, a wave of grief and despair washing over her. She had tried so hard to be strong, to be resilient, to face the future with courage and determination. But the sight of the wagon, a physical embodiment of her failure, threatened to unravel her carefully constructed defenses. Rhett, sensing her distress, reined in his horse beside hers. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort, but his presence was a steadying force, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone in this. "It's worse than I remembered," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rhett nodded, his eyes scanning the scene, assessing the damage. "We'll see what we can salvage," he said, his voice calm and practical. "Might be some things worth taking with us." He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached the wagon cautiously, as if approaching a wounded animal, wary of its pain and its potential to lash out. Josie followed suit, her legs feeling heavy, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood beside the wagon, her hand resting on the splintered wood of the broken wheel. She closed her eyes, her mind conjuring images of the past, of happier times when the wagon had been a symbol of hope and new beginnings. She remembered the day she and Thomas had bought it, brand new, from the wagon maker in Abilene. They had been so excited, so full of dreams, planning their journey west, their new life together on the ranch they had inherited from Thomas's uncle. They had painted it a cheerful blue, with white trim, and Josie had sewn curtains for the windows, adding a touch of domesticity to the rugged vehicle. They had packed it with care, filling it with everything they would need to start their new life. Furniture, tools, seeds, linens, and a few cherished family heirlooms. But that life had never materialized. Thomas's death, his betrayal, had shattered their dreams, leaving her with nothing but a broken wagon and a broken heart.
Josie?
Rhett's voice broke through her reverie, pulling her back to the present. She opened her eyes, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. She saw Rhett standing beside the wagon, holding a small wooden box. "Found this," he said, his voice gentle. "Looks like it might be important." Josie took the box, her hands trembling. It was her jewelry box, a gift from her mother, containing a few precious pieces that had belonged to her grandmother, a silver locket, a pair of pearl earrings, a delicate gold bracelet. She opened the box, her heart aching with a mixture of nostalgia and grief. The jewelry was still there, nestled in the velvet lining, seemingly untouched by the elements. She picked up the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on its surface. It contained a tiny portrait of her mother, a faded image of a smiling young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. A wave of emotion washed over her, a surge of love and loss that brought tears to her eyes. She had forgotten about the jewelry, about the sentimental value of these small objects that connected her to her past, to her family, to a time before the pain and the betrayal. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Rhett nodded, understanding. He didn't pry, didn't ask about the contents of the box. He simply stood there, offering his silent support, his unwavering presence. They spent the next few hours sifting through the wreckage of the wagon, salvaging what they could. They found a few tools, some blankets, a cooking pot, and a few other essentials that would be useful on their journey to Harmony Springs. Most everything else was ruined and of little use. As they worked, Josie's thoughts drifted back to Thomas, to the man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her. She wondered if he had ever truly loved her, or if it had all been a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide his dark secrets. She found a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a corner of the wagon bed. It was Thomas's journal, a private record of his thoughts and feelings. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she read it? Would it reveal the truth about him, about his double life? Or would it only open old wounds, causing her more pain? She opened the book, her hands trembling. The first few pages were filled with mundane entries, descriptions of their daily life on the ranch, notes about the weather, the crops, the livestock. But as she turned the pages, she found entries that made her heart sink. He wrote about his gambling debts, his growing desperation, his fear of the men he owed money to. He wrote about his secret meetings, his clandestine activities, his growing involvement with a group of outlaws. He wrote about his love for her, his guilt, his shame, his fear that she would discover the truth. He wrote about his desire to protect her, to shield her from the danger he had brought upon them. Josie closed the book, her hands shaking. The truth was worse than she had imagined. He had been living a lie, a dangerous game that had ultimately cost him his life and shattered hers. She felt a surge of anger, a bitter resentment towards the man who had betrayed her, the man who had destroyed their dreams. But beneath the anger, there was also a profound sadness, a deep sense of loss for the man she had thought she knew, the man she had loved. Rhett, seeing her distress, came over and sat beside her. He took the journal from her hands, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. Josie couldn't speak. She simply pointed to the journal, her eyes filled with tears. Rhett opened the book, his gaze scanning the pages. He read in silence for a few minutes, his expression growing grim. "I'm sorry, Josie," he said finally, his voice filled with compassion.
"I'm so sorry."
He closed the book, his hand gently covering hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of support in the face of her overwhelming grief. But the words in the journal, the sting of betrayal, echoed in her mind. Chapter 12. A glimmer of trust in the heart of darkness. The sun beat down mercilessly, the heat reflecting off the parched earth, mirroring the burning turmoil within Josie. The journal lay between them, a silent testament to the betrayal that had shattered her life, a stark reminder of the pain she had tried so hard to bury. Rhett's hand still rested on hers, a comforting weight, a tangible connection in a world that felt increasingly unstable. She looked at him, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a compassion that she hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. It's worse than I thought," she said, her voice hoarse, her throat tight with unshed tears. He was living a complete lie. Rhett nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "But it doesn't change who you are, Josie. It doesn't diminish the good memories, the love you shared." His words, though meant to comfort, struck a raw nerve. How could he say that? How could he possibly understand the depth of her betrayal, the shattering of her trust, the destruction of her dreams? "Easy for you to say," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "You didn't know him. You didn't love him. You didn't build a life with him, only to have it all ripped away." He flinched slightly, as if her words had physically struck him. He removed his hand from hers, a shadow of hurt crossing his face. "No, I didn't," he said, his voice quiet. "But I know what it's like to lose someone, to have your trust betrayed, to feel like your whole world has been turned upside down." His words surprised her. She had seen glimpses of his pain, his hidden wounds, but he had never spoken about them directly. She had assumed his reticence stemmed from a desire to keep his past private, to maintain a distance. But now she realized it was more than that. It was a deep-seated pain, a vulnerability that he guarded carefully, revealing only to those he trusted. And he was trusting her, she realized, with a sudden clarity that took her breath away. He was sharing his pain with her, offering her a glimpse into his own heart, forging a connection that transcended their circumstances, their differences. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer now, her anger dissipating. "I didn't mean to lash out." He shook his head, dismissing her apology.
"It's all right," he said.
"You have every right to be angry, to be hurt." He looked at the journal, his expression grim.
"What will you do with it?"
he asked. Josie hesitated. She had thought about burning it, destroying the evidence of Thomas's betrayal, erasing his memory from her life. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was a part of her past, a part of her story, however painful. "I don't know," she said. "I can't destroy it, but I can't keep reading it either." Rhett nodded, understanding. He picked up the journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "I'll keep it for you," he said. "Safe. Until you decide what you want to do with it." His offer surprised her. It was a gesture of trust, a willingness to shoulder her burden, to share her pain. It was a sign of the bond that was growing between them, a connection forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. I appreciate it." He placed the journal in his saddlebag, securing it carefully. He then turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "We should get going," he said. "We're losing daylight." Josie nodded, rising to her feet. She felt drained, emotionally exhausted, but also lighter, somehow. Rhett's understanding, his willingness to share her burden, had eased the weight on her heart, had offered her a glimmer of hope in the heart of darkness. They mounted their horses, setting off towards Harmony Springs, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. The journey was silent, but it was no longer a silence of tension and distrust. It was a silence of shared understanding, of mutual respect, of a growing bond that was slowly but surely healing the wounds of the past. As they rode, Josie's thoughts drifted back to Rhett's words, his admission of his own pain, his own loss. She wondered about his past, about the person he had failed to protect. She wanted to know more, to understand the story behind his scars, the burden he carried. But she knew that she couldn't push him. She had to respect his privacy, his reticence. Trust, she realized, was a fragile thing, easily broken, hard to rebuild. It had to be earned, nurtured, given freely, without expectation. And she was beginning to trust him, she realized, with a growing certainty that warmed her from the inside out. She was beginning to see him not just as a stranger, a protector, but as a friend, a companion, someone she could rely on, someone she could confide in. It was a glimmer of trust, a fragile seed planted in the barren soil of her broken heart. But it was there, nonetheless, a promise of hope, a possibility of healing, a chance for a new beginning. The wagon was behind them, both literally and figuratively. But the question now was, what lay ahead? Chapter 13. The Price of Freedom and the Cost of Loyalty. The landscape gradually shifted as they approached Harmony Springs. The vast, open plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with juniper and mesquite trees. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the dry, dusty heat of the open prairie. Josie felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension as they rode. Harmony Springs was a new beginning, a chance to escape the shadows of her past, to build a new life for herself. But it was also an unknown, a step into the uncertainty of the future, a leap of faith that required courage and resilience. She glanced at Rhett, riding beside her, his profile stark against the fading light. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. She wondered what he was thinking, what his plans were, once they reached the town. Would he stay? Or would he move on, continuing his solitary journey, leaving her to face the challenges of her new life alone? The thought sent a pang of sadness through her. She had grown accustomed to his presence, his quiet strength, his unwavering support. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, in a way she hadn't thought possible just a few short days ago. How much further? She asked, breaking the silence. He looked at her, his eyes meeting hers.
Not far, he said.
We should reach the outskirts by nightfall. His words were reassuring, but they also carried a hint of finality. The journey was coming to an end, and with it, perhaps their connection, their shared adventure. As they rode, Josie's thoughts drifted back to Abilene, to the events that had led her to this point. She had left everything behind, her home, her friends, her familiar life, in a desperate attempt to escape the whispers and the judgment of the townspeople. She had sought freedom, a chance to start over, to rebuild her shattered life. But freedom, she was learning, came at a price. The price of loneliness, of uncertainty, of facing the unknown alone. And then there was the cost of loyalty. Thomas's loyalty to his gambling partners, to his secret life, had cost him his life, and it had cost her everything she held dear. Her loyalty to him, her blind trust, had made her vulnerable, had left her exposed to the harsh realities of the world. She wondered about Rhett's loyalty. Where did his allegiances lie? To whom was he beholden? Could she truly trust him, or was he, too, hiding secrets, harboring ulterior motives? The questions plagued her, swirling in her mind like the dust devils that danced on the horizon. She had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, hard to rebuild. And she was wary of giving her trust too freely, of making herself vulnerable again. As they approached the outskirts of Harmony Springs, they saw the faint glow of lights in the distance, a beacon of civilization in the vast darkness. The town was small, nestled in a valley surrounded by hills, a cluster of buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the elements. They rode into town slowly, their horses' hooves echoing on the hard-packed dirt road. The streets were mostly deserted, the only signs of life coming from the brightly lit saloons, where the sounds of music and laughter spilled out into the night. Rhett reined in his horse in front of a small, unassuming building with a sign that read Harmony Springs Livery and Stable. "We'll find you a room at the boarding house," he said, dismounting. "Then we can get your horse settled here for the night." Josie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This was it. Her new beginning. Her chance to start over. They dismounted, Rhett helping Josie down from her horse. He led the horses to the stable, where a sleepy-eyed stable boy took their reins. Rhett then led Josie to the boarding house, a 2-story wooden building with a welcoming porch and brightly lit windows. The landlady, a stout, matronly woman with a kind face and a warm smile, greeted them at the door. "Welcome to Harmony Springs," she said. "You looking for a room?" Rhett nodded. "Just for the lady," he said. "I'll be staying at the stable." Josie's heart sank. He wasn't staying. He was leaving her, just as she had feared. The landlady showed Josie to a small but clean and comfortable room on the second floor. It had a bed, a washstand, a small table, and a window that overlooked the main street. It wasn't much, but it was a sanctuary, a safe haven from the uncertainties of the outside world. "This is fine," she said when the woman asked. "Thank you." Josie stood at the window, her stomach in knots. She looked toward the door and then back out at the street. She was alone again, in a place she had never been. The tears welled up again, and she let herself cry, the emotion overwhelming. Chapter 14. Confronting the demons of a shared past. The tears flowed freely, a release of pent-up emotions, a torrent of grief, fear, and uncertainty. Josie sank onto the bed, her body shaking with sobs, her hands clutching the thin fabric of the bedspread. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of unfamiliar faces and uncertain futures. She had thought that reaching Harmony Springs would bring her peace, a sense of closure, a chance to start anew. But now, standing in this small, unfamiliar room, the weight of her past pressed down on her with renewed force. She was free from Abilene, from the whispers and the judgment, but she was not free from her memories, from the pain of her loss, from the sting of her betrayal. A knock on the door startled her. She quickly wiped her eyes, composing herself as best she could. "Come in," she said, her voice still shaky. The door opened, and Rhett stepped inside. He looked concerned, his eyes searching hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Josie hesitated, then shook her head. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can do this, Rhett. I don't know if I'm strong enough." He closed the door behind him, his presence filling the small room, a reassuring warmth in the midst of her turmoil. He sat down on the edge of the bed, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to intrude on her space. "You are strong enough, Josie," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "You've been through so much and you've survived. You're stronger than you think." His words, his unwavering belief in her, touched her deeply. She had doubted herself, questioned her strength, her ability to cope with the challenges that lay ahead. But he saw something in her, resilience, a spirit that she had forgotten she possessed. "But I'm scared," she said, her voice trembling. "Scared of the future, scared of being alone, scared of everything." He nodded, understanding. "It's all right to be scared," he said. "It's natural. But you don't have to face it alone, Josie. I'm here. I'll help you." His words, his promise, were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness of her despair. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, in a way she hadn't thought possible. He was more than just a protector, a guide. He was a friend, a companion, someone who understood her pain, her fears, her vulnerabilities. "But you said you were staying at the stable," she said, her voice hesitant, remembering his earlier words. "You're leaving?" He shook his head.
"I'm not leaving Josie," he said.
"Not yet. I'll stay in Harmony Springs for a while. Make sure you're settled, help you get on your feet." His words were a balm to her soul, a soothing reassurance that she wouldn't be abandoned, left to fend for herself in this unfamiliar town. She felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that spread through her, chasing away the chill of fear and loneliness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"You don't know how much that means to me."
He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. His touch was warm and comforting, a silent promise of support and understanding. "We all need someone, Josie," he said. "We all need a helping hand, a shoulder to cry on, someone to share the burdens of life." His words resonated with her, echoing the thoughts she had had earlier when they had talked about scars, about loss, about the need for connection. They were both wounded, both scarred by their pasts, but they were also survivors, fighters, capable of finding strength in each other, of healing together. "I know about Jedediah," Josie began, looking down at her hands. "I know he was one of the men my husband owed." Rhett looked surprised, but nodded. "He told me you seemed familiar, but I couldn't be sure."
"I saw him back in Abilene. He was the one who he told me what happened.
Warn me to leave town. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a question, but she cut him off.
I need to talk to him.
Rhett looked as if he were about to disagree, to tell her to stay away. But he must have thought better of it. He gave a brisk nod, his jaw tight. He knew as well as she did that until she knew the truth, she'd never move forward. They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the gentle ticking of a clock on the bedside table. The shared understanding, the unspoken bond between them, was a palpable presence in the room, a silent testament to the journey they had shared, the challenges they had overcome, the demons they had confronted together. The question was how to find Jedediah and what would happen when they did. Chapter 15. A desperate gamble for a future uncertain. The decision to confront Jedediah hung in the air, heavy and fraught with uncertainty. Josie knew it was a risk, a dangerous gamble, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was necessary, a crucial step towards finding closure, towards building a future free from the shadows of her past. We need a plan, Rhett said, breaking the silence, his voice thoughtful. We can't just walk into the saloon and demand to see him. It's too risky. He'll have his men with him, and we'll be outnumbered. Josie nodded, her mind racing. She knew he was right. A direct confrontation would be foolish, potentially deadly. They needed a strategy, a way to approach Jedediah on their own terms, without alerting his men, without putting themselves in unnecessary danger. He said they were just passing through, she said, remembering Jedediah's words from their encounter on the plains. But he also said they were low on water. They might have stopped here for supplies, maybe even stayed the night. Rhett nodded, considering her words. It's worth a try, he said. We can check the saloons, the livery stable, see if anyone has seen them. But we need to be careful. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. They left the boarding house, stepping out into the cool night air. The town was more lively now, the saloons bustling with activity, the sounds of music and laughter spilling out into the streets. They walked slowly, keeping to the shadows, their eyes scanning the faces of the people they passed, searching for any sign of Jedediah or his men. They checked the first saloon, a dimly lit, smoky establishment filled with cowboys, miners, and drifters. The air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco, the noise level almost deafening. They didn't see Jedediah or his men, so they moved on, checking the other saloons one by one. The livery stable was their next stop. The stable boy, a young, freckled-faced lad, was still awake, tending to the horses. Rhett asked him if he had seen a group of riders matching Jedediah's description. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the stable. I might have, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They came in earlier, asking about water and supplies. Said they were heading west. Did they say where they were going? Rhett asked, his voice urgent. The boy shook his head.
No, sir.
Just said they were moving on. Did they buy anything? Supplies? Horses? Josie asked. Just some water and some jerky, the boy said. Paid in cash. Didn't say much else. Rhett thanked the boy, slipping him a coin for his trouble. They left the stable, their hopes dwindling. It seemed Jedediah had already left town, disappearing into the vastness of the frontier, leaving Josie with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of unease. Maybe he was telling the truth, Josie said, her voice tinged with disappointment. Maybe he was just passing through. Rhett didn't respond. He stood there, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be wrestling with something, weighing his options, calculating the risks. There's one more place we can check, he said finally, his voice determined. The old abandoned mine just outside of town. It's a known hideout for outlaws, a place where they can lie low, avoid the law. Josie's heart skipped a beat. The mine. It was a dangerous place, a haven for criminals and desperados. But it was also their last hope, their only chance to find Jedediah, to confront him about her husband's past. It's risky, she said, her voice trembling. Rhett nodded. I know, he said, but we have to try. We have to find out the truth. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. You don't have to come, Josie, he said. I can go alone. It's too dangerous for you. Josie shook her head.
No, she said, her voice firm.
I'm going with you. I need to know. I need to face him. She had come this far, endured so much. She wouldn't back down now. She wouldn't let fear paralyze her. She would face her demons, confront her past, and fight for her future, even if it meant risking her life. They set off towards the mine, the darkness closing in around them, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. It was a desperate gamble, a risky undertaking, but Josie felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet determination that fueled her steps. She was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to confront the truth, no matter how painful, and to finally, hopefully, find some measure of peace. She was also certain of one other thing. She would never forget Rhett for standing with her, to face a very uncertain future. Chapter 16. The unraveling of secrets under a blazing Sunday. The old mine loomed before them, a gaping maw in the side of the hill, a dark and forbidding presence under the faint moonlight. The entrance was partially collapsed, the timbers rotting and crumbling, the surrounding area littered with discarded equipment and piles of loose rock. It was a desolate, dangerous place, a haven for shadows and secrets. Josie felt a shiver of apprehension run down her spine. She had heard stories about the mine, tales of outlaws and gunfights, of hidden treasures and lost souls. It was a place where the law held no sway, where violence and desperation reigned supreme. Rhett, sensing her fear, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Stay close to me," he whispered, "and be ready for anything." Josie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She drew strength from his presence, from his unwavering courage, from the silent promise of protection that he had offered her. They approached the mine entrance cautiously, their senses on high alert, their ears straining for any sound that might betray the presence of others. The air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, a faint hint of something else smoke. Rhett stopped, his hand signaling Josie to stay back. He peered into the darkness, his eyes scanning the shadows, his body tense and ready for action. "Someone's inside," he whispered. "I can smell the smoke from their campfire." Josie's heart skipped a beat. Jedediah. It had to be him. He was here, waiting for them, perhaps, or simply seeking refuge from the prying eyes of the law. Rhett drew his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate. He motioned for Josie to stay behind him, his body shielding her from any potential danger. They crept into the mine, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast, silent darkness. The air grew colder, damper, the smell of smoke stronger. They could see the faint glow of a campfire ahead, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the tunnel. As they drew closer, they could hear voices, low and muffled, the murmur of conversation indistinguishable. Rhett stopped, his hand signaling Josie to wait. He peered around the corner, his eyes scanning the scene before them. He saw Jedediah and his men, sitting around a small campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were talking, laughing, their weapons laid aside, their guards seemingly down. Rhett motioned for Josie to come forward. He pointed to a narrow crevice in the wall, a hiding place where she could observe the scene without being seen. Josie slipped into the crevice, her body pressed against the cold, damp rock. She could see Jedediah clearly, his face etched with weariness, his eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked older, more haggard than she remembered, his beard streaked with gray, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. Rhett stepped out into the open, his rifle held ready, his voice loud and clear. "Jedediah," he called out. "We need to talk." The men around the campfire jumped to their feet, their hands reaching for their weapons. Jedediah, however, remained seated, his gaze fixed on Rhett, his expression unreadable. Well, he said, his voice calm and surprisingly steady. "Look what the cat dragged in. The gunfighter and the widow." His words, his tone, sent a chill down Josie's spine. He knew who she was, who Rhett was. He had been expecting them, perhaps. "We know about Thomas," Rhett said, his voice firm. "We know about his debts, his involvement with you and your men." Jedediah nodded, his eyes flickering towards the crevice, where Josie was hiding. So, she finally figured it out, he said, a hint of sadness in his voice. Took her long enough. What happened, Jedediah? Josie asked, stepping out from the hiding place. Her voice was trembling, but firm. Tell me the truth. Tell me what happened to my husband. Jedediah looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. It's a long story, ma'am, he said. A complicated one. I have time, Josie said, her gaze unwavering. Jedediah sighed, his shoulders slumping. He motioned for his men to lower their weapons. Sit down, he said, gesturing towards the fire. Both of you. They sat down, facing Jedediah, the firelight casting dancing shadows on their faces. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the crackling of the flames. Jedediah began to speak, his voice low and somber, his words painting a picture of a world far removed from Josie's sheltered life, a world of gambling, debt, and desperation. He told her how Thomas had gotten involved with them, how he had borrowed money to cover his gambling losses, how he had fallen deeper and deeper into debt, unable to escape the clutches of the men he owed. He told her how he had tried to help Thomas, how he had warned him about the dangers of his lifestyle, how he had pleaded with him to quit gambling, to seek help. He had given Thomas an out, a way to pay off his debts by riding with them on FEW jobs. Thomas had refused, at first, clinging to the idea of his perfect life, Josie's perception of him. But the debts were insurmountable, the threats real. He had agreed, riding with them twice on small jobs, and a third was planned. He had a good heart, your husband, Jedediah said, his voice filled with a surprising tenderness. But he was weak. He was a gambler, addicted to the thrill, the risk, the promise of easy money. He told her how Thomas had been killed, not in a gunfight, as she had been led to believe, but in a botched robbery, a desperate attempt to steal enough money to pay off his debts. The third ride. Jedediah hadn't even been there. He told her how he had tried to protect her, how he had warned her to leave Abilene, to escape the reach of the men who had killed her husband, the men who might still be looking for the money they believed Thomas had stolen. It wasn't Thomas who had stolen the money. It was another rider who had then, in turn, been killed by Jedediah himself. Josie listened, her heart aching, her mind reeling. The truth was far more complicated, far more painful, than she had ever imagined. Thomas hadn't been a hero, a victim, but a flawed, desperate man who had made terrible choices, who had paid the ultimate price for his mistakes. But he hadn't died owing anyone anything. The sun was starting to come up, the first light peeking through the mine entrance. The blazing light did nothing to quell the burning questions in Josie's heart. Chapter 17. Blood on the sand and tears in the dust. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the dust motes illuminated by the encroaching dawn. Josie felt numb, her mind struggling to process the torrent of information, the twisted reality of Thomas's life and death. He had been neither the villain she had imagined, nor the saint she had once believed him to be. He had been a man, flawed and vulnerable, caught in a web of his own making. So, he didn't steal the money? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, seeking confirmation, a glimmer of redemption in the wreckage of her illusions. Jedediah shook his head. No, ma'am, he said. He didn't. It was another man, a rider named Bart. He took the money, and I dealt with him. His words, his tone, the grim set of his jaw, left no doubt as to Bart's fate. Josie felt a shiver run down her spine, a cold realization of the brutal world her husband had inhabited, the violence that had ultimately consumed him. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, her voice trembling. Why did you let me believe the lies? Jedediah looked at her, his eyes filled with a weariness that seemed to span a lifetime. I tried to protect you, ma'am, he said. I thought it was best for you to leave, to start over, without knowing the full truth. It was a messy situation, dangerous. I didn't want you caught in the crossfire. His explanation, though laced with a semblance of concern, felt hollow, unsatisfying. He had kept her in the dark, allowed her to live with a false narrative, a burden of guilt and shame that had haunted her for months. "But I deserve to know," she said, her voice rising, her anger finally surfacing. "I deserve the truth, no matter how painful." Rhett, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, placed a calming hand on her arm. "Easy, Josie," he said, his voice gentle. "It's over now. You know the truth." She looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. He understood. She realized the depth of her pain, the need for closure, the longing for justice. He had been her anchor, her protector, her confidant throughout this ordeal, and she was grateful for his unwavering support. "What about the money?" Rhett asked, turning his attention to Jedediah. "The money Bart stole. What happened to it?" Jedediah shrugged.
"It's gone," he said.
"Spent, I reckon. Bart was a gambler, just like your husband. He likely lost it all at the tables." His answer, though plausible, felt incomplete. Josie sensed that there was more to the story, a missing piece of the puzzle that Jedediah was deliberately withholding. "Are you sure?" she asked, her gaze fixed on his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Is there anything else you're not telling us?" Jedediah hesitated, his eyes flickering away from hers. He seemed to be wrestling with something, a conflict between his loyalty to his past and his desire to be honest with her. There's one more thing," he said finally, his voice low and hesitant. "The money, it wasn't all gone. Bart had a stash, a hidden cache somewhere near here. I never found it." Josie's heart skipped a beat. A hidden cache. A treasure, perhaps, or simply a reminder of her husband's dark past. It was a dangerous secret, a potential threat, a loose end that needed to be tied. "Where?" Rhett asked, his voice sharp and demanding. "Where is it hidden?" Jedediah shook his head.
"I don't know," he said.
"I searched for it, but I never found it. It's likely buried somewhere in these hills, lost to time." His words, his uncertainty, sparked a flicker of hope in Josie's heart. The money, if it existed, could be her salvation, a way to start over, to build a new life for herself, free from the debts and the shadows of her past. But it was also a dangerous pursuit, a gamble that could put her life at risk. Jedediah's men, she realized, might still be looking for the money, might be willing to kill to get their hands on it. "We need to find it," she said, her voice firm, her determination fueled by a mixture of hope and desperation. "We need to find that money." Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "It's too risky, Josie," he said. "We don't know who else might be looking for it. We could be walking into a trap." "I don't care," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have to try. It's my only chance." She looked at Jedediah, her gaze pleading. "Will you help us?"
she asked.
"Will you help us find it?" Jedediah hesitated, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing the risks, the potential consequences of his decision. "All right, ma'am, and you," he said, inclining his head to both Josie and Rhett. "I'll ride with you. For a few days. I know these hills like the back of my hand. I can help you search." He stood, and the others followed suit. "But one sign of trouble, and I am out. Agreed?" Before Josie could respond, a gunshot rang out. One of Jedediah's men cried out and fell to his knees, clutching at his side. Blood, bright crimson against the pale sand, seeped through his fingers. Chapter 18. The fragile promise of a new dawn. Chaos erupted. Jedediah's men scrambled for cover, their weapons drawn, their eyes darting around the mine, searching for the source of the attack. Josie and Rhett dove to the ground, seeking shelter behind a pile of loose rocks, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Who's out there?" Jedediah roared, his voice echoing through the mine. "Show yourselves." Silence. Only the echoes of his voice and the ragged breathing of his wounded man answered him. Rhett peered cautiously over the rocks, his rifle raised, his senses on high alert. He scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the attacker's presence. "I don't see anyone," he whispered to Josie. "They must be hiding in the shadows." Another gunshot rang out, this one closer, the bullet whizzing past Rhett's head, embedding itself in the rock wall behind them. Josie gasped, her body trembling with fear. Stay down, Red ordered, his voice low and urgent. He returned fire, aiming at the direction of the shot, but his bullets hit nothing but rock and darkness. The gunfight continued, sporadic and intense, the echoes of the shots reverberating through the mine, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the scene in brief, fleeting moments. Josie huddled behind the rocks, her hands covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had never been in a gunfight before, had never experienced the terror of being caught in the crossfire, the fear of imminent death. It was a brutal, terrifying reality, a stark contrast to the quiet, sheltered life she had once known. She thought of Thomas, of his death in a botched robbery, of the violence that had consumed him. She had always imagined it as a distant, abstract event, a tragedy that had happened to someone else. But now, she was experiencing it firsthand, the fear, the chaos, the senselessness of it all. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence descended upon the mine, a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the groans of Jedediah's wounded man. Rhett cautiously raised his head, his eyes scanning the darkness. "I think they're gone," he whispered. "But we need to get out of here.
Now."
They helped Jedediah's wounded man to his feet, supporting his weight between them. They stumbled out of the mine, into the blinding light of the rising sun, their bodies aching, their nerves frayed, their minds reeling from the violence they had just witnessed. The attackers were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a trail of blood and tears, a reminder of the fragility of life, the ever-present danger that lurked in the shadows of the frontier. Jedediah examined his man's wound. It was a clean shot through and through, but it had missed any vital organs. He would survive, but he needed medical attention and quickly. "We need to get him to a doctor," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "There's a small settlement, about a day's ride from here. They might have someone who can help." They set off, riding slowly, the wounded man groaning with every jolt of the horse. Josie rode beside Rhett, her body still trembling, her mind struggling to process the events of the past few hours.
"Who were they?"
she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who would attack us like that?" Rhett shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "Could be anyone. Outlaws, bounty hunters, someone looking for the money, or someone with a grudge against Jedediah." His words offered little comfort. The attack had shattered their fragile sense of security, their hope for a peaceful resolution. It was a stark reminder that the past was not yet behind them, that the dangers they faced were real and ever-present. They rode in silence for the rest of the day, the weight of their unspoken fears hanging heavy between them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Josie's thoughts turned to the future, to the uncertain path that lay ahead. She had come to Harmony Springs seeking a new beginning, a chance to escape the shadows of her past. But the past, she was learning, was not so easily escaped. It clung to her like a persistent shadow, a constant reminder of the losses she had suffered, the betrayals she had endured. But amidst the darkness, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of a new dawn. She had found a friend, a protector, in Rhett, a man who had stood by her, who had shared her burdens, who had offered her his unwavering support. She had learned the truth about her husband, a truth that was both painful and liberating. She had confronted her demons, faced her fears, and emerged stronger, more resilient than she had ever thought possible. She stole a look at Rhett, riding beside her. His eyes were fixed on the distant horizon. She knew he would protect her. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that they would face their challenges together. The question was, where would they go next? Chapter 19. A choice between vengeance and forgiveness. The journey to the settlement was arduous, the wounded man's condition worsening with each passing hour. They rode through the night, guided by the stars, their bodies aching, their minds numb with exhaustion. Josie's thoughts were a jumble of fear, uncertainty, and a growing sense of resolve. She had come too far, endured too much, to give up now. They reached the settlement at dawn, a small, dusty collection of buildings huddled around a muddy creek. It was a desolate, impoverished place, a far cry from the bustling town of Harmony Springs. But it offered a glimmer of hope, a chance for the wounded man to receive medical attention, a respite from the relentless pursuit of their unknown attackers. They found a doctor, a grizzled old man with weary eyes and a shaky hand, who examined the wounded man's injury. He cleaned and bandaged the wound, his movements slow and deliberate, his prognosis guarded. "He'll live," he said, his voice raspy. "But he needs rest and plenty of it. He's lost a lot of blood." Jedediah and his remaining men settled the wounded man in a small, makeshift infirmary, a single room attached to the doctor's office. They thanked the doctor, paying him for his services, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. Josie and Rhett stood outside, the morning sun warming their faces, the sounds of the settlement slowly coming to life around them. They had survived the attack, the perilous journey, but the future remained uncertain, the threat of their pursuers still looming large.
What now?
Josie asked, her voice tired, her eyes searching Rhett's. He looked at her, his expression grim.
"We need to figure out who attacked us," he said. "And why?"
He paused, his gaze shifting towards the infirmary, where Jedediah and his men were tending to their wounded comrade. "I don't trust Jedediah," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I think he knows more than he's letting on." Josie nodded, her own suspicions mirroring his. Jedediah's evasiveness, his reluctance to reveal the full truth about Thomas's past, his convenient appearance at the mine, it all added up to a sense of unease, a nagging doubt that she couldn't shake. "You think he set us up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rhett shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "But it's possible. He could be working with the men who attacked us, trying to get his hands on the money Bart stole." It was a chilling thought, a betrayal that would cut Josie to the core. She had trusted Jedediah, had confided in him, had sought his help in finding closure, in starting a new life. "We need to be careful," Rhett said, his voice urgent. "We can't trust anyone. Not until we know who's behind this." They decided to stay in the settlement for a few days, allowing the wounded man to recover, while they gathered information, trying to piece together the puzzle of the attack, the identity of their pursuers. They spoke to the locals, asking about any strangers who had passed through town, any rumors of outlaws or bounty hunters in the area. They learned little, the people of the settlement wary of outsiders, reluctant to share information. As the days passed, Josie's thoughts turned increasingly to Thomas, to the life they had shared, the betrayal that had shattered her world. She had come to terms with his flaws, his weaknesses, his tragic end. But she still struggled with the pain of his deception, the loss of the future they had planned together. She found herself drawn to the small, dusty cemetery on the outskirts of the settlement, a place of quiet contemplation, where the dead rested beneath weathered headstones, their stories etched in stone. She wandered among the graves, reading the names, the dates, the epitaphs, her heart aching with a sense of shared loss, a universal sorrow that transcended time and place. She found a quiet spot beneath a gnarled oak tree, where she sat and reflected on her life, her choices, her regrets. She thought of Thomas, of his love, his laughter, his tragic flaws. She thought of Rhett, of his kindness, his strength, his unwavering support. She realized that she had a choice to make. A choice between vengeance and forgiveness, between holding on to the anger and the bitterness of the past, or embracing the possibility of a new future, a new love, a new life. She could pursue Jedediah, seek revenge for his betrayal, for his role in Thomas's death. Or she could let go of the past, forgive him, forgive Thomas, forgive herself, and move on, embracing the hope of a brighter tomorrow. The choice was hers, and hers alone. It was a difficult choice, a painful one, but it was also a liberating one. It was a chance to break free from the chains of the past, to forge a new path, to create a new destiny. She looked up at the sky, the vast expanse of blue stretching above her, the sun warming her face, the wind whispering through the leaves of the oak tree. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the peace of the moment, the quiet strength that was growing within her. She knew what she had to do. It would require immense courage and strength. But she also knew that she had it within her. She would move forward. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Josie found Rhett at the edge of the settlement, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his posture reflecting the weight of their shared predicament. He turned as she approached, his eyes searching hers, a silent question in their depths. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice firm, her resolve clear. "I'm not going to pursue Jedediah. I'm not going to seek revenge." Relief washed over Rhett's face, a subtle softening of his features that spoke volumes. He had been worried about her. She realized, concerned that the pain of her past would consume her, drive her towards a path of self-destruction. "I'm glad, Josie," he said, his voice gentle. "It's the right choice. Vengeance won't bring Thomas back. It won't heal your wounds. It will only poison your soul." She nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of sadness and acceptance.
He was right.
Vengeance was a hollow pursuit, a destructive force that would only perpetuate the cycle of violence and pain. "I want to forgive him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to forgive Thomas and Jedediah and myself. I want to let go of the past and move on." Rhett reached out, his hand gently covering hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent affirmation of her decision, a promise of his continued support. "It won't be easy, Josie," he said. "Forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. It takes time and courage and a willingness to confront your own demons." She knew he was right. Forgiveness was a process, a gradual release of the anger, the bitterness, the resentment that had taken root in her heart. It was a conscious choice, a daily commitment to let go of the past, to embrace the possibility of a brighter future. "I know," she said, her voice stronger now. "But I'm ready. I'm ready to start that journey." They stood there for a moment, their hands clasped together, their gazes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. They had shared so much, endured so much together. They had faced danger, betrayal, loss, and grief. And they had emerged stronger, more resilient, their bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "What about the money?" Rhett asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Bart's stash. Are you giving up on that, too?" Josie hesitated. The money, if it existed, could change her life, provide her with the security and independence she craved. But it was also a dangerous pursuit, a temptation that could lead them back into the darkness they had so narrowly escaped. "I don't know," she said, her voice uncertain. I haven't decided yet." Rhett nodded, understanding her dilemma. "It's your decision, Josie," he said. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." His words, his unwavering loyalty, warmed her heart. She had found a true friend in him, a companion, a protector, someone she could trust implicitly, someone who believed in her, even when she doubted herself. They decided to leave the settlement the next morning, heading back towards Harmony Springs. They had unfinished business there, a need to tie up loose ends, to make arrangements for their future. As they rode, Josie's thoughts turned to Rhett, to the unspoken feelings that had grown between them. She had come to rely on him, to admire him, to care for him in a way that went beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. She wondered if he felt the same way. He had shown her kindness, compassion, unwavering support. He had protected her, defended her, stood by her through thick and thin. But he had also guarded his heart, kept his emotions at bay, revealing little of his own desires, his own dreams. She knew that he carried his own scars, his own burdens from the past. She had glimpsed his vulnerability, his pain, but she had never fully understood the depth of his wounds, the secrets he held close. She longed to know him better, to understand him fully, to share her heart with him, to offer him the same love and support that he had given her. But she was afraid of rejection, afraid of opening herself up to more pain, afraid of risking the fragile bond they had forged. As they approached Harmony Springs, Josie knew that she had another decision to make. A decision about her future, about her heart, about the possibility of a new love, a new beginning. They arrived in Harmony Springs as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. They rode directly to the boarding house, where Josie had left her belongings. The landlady greeted them warmly, her face lighting up with recognition. "Welcome back, Josie," she said. "I'm glad to see you all right." Josie smiled, grateful for the woman's kindness.
"Thank you," she said.
"It's good to be back." Rhett helped her unload her belongings from the horses, carrying them up to her room. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. I need to talk to you, Rhett," Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. "About us." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "I've been wanting to talk to you, too." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "Josie," he said, his voice filled with emotion. I care about you."
"Deeply."
"More than I ever thought possible." His words, his confession, sent a wave of warmth through her, a surge of joy that chased away the lingering shadows of the past. She had hoped, she had dreamed, but she had never dared to believe that he felt the same way. "I care about you, too, Rhett," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "More than words can say." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. His touch was tender, loving, a promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sealed their bond, their love, their shared destiny. It was a kiss of hope, of healing, of a new beginning, a promise of a life together, free from the shadows of the past, filled with the warmth of love, the light of a new dawn. Josie closed her eyes. It was a new beginning, in a world that was both harsh and beautiful. Epilogue. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The frontier was a harsh and unforgiving place, testing their resilience, their courage, and their love at every turn. There were droughts and storms, and the constant threat of danger from outlaws and renegades. But Josie and Rhett faced them all together, their bond strengthened by each shared trial, their love a constant source of comfort and strength. They settled on a small ranch a few miles outside of Harmony Springs, a modest homestead nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a sanctuary where they could build a life together, free from the shadows of their pasts. Rhett, with Josie's unwavering support, finally confronted the demons that had haunted him for so long. He spoke of the woman he had failed to protect, a young sister who had been taken from him by raiders, a loss that had fueled his solitary life, his relentless pursuit of justice. He had carried the guilt and the grief for years, blaming himself for her death, seeking redemption in the protection of others. Josie listened, her heart aching for him, her love a balm to his wounded soul. She offered him understanding, compassion, and the unwavering promise of her love, helping him to heal, to forgive himself, to embrace the possibility of a future filled with happiness and peace. They never found Bart's stash. The money, if it ever existed, remained lost to time, buried somewhere in the vast expanse of the Texas plains. But they didn't need it. They had each other, and they had their love, a treasure far more valuable than any gold or silver. Josie never forgot Thomas. She kept his journal, a reminder of his flawed humanity, his tragic end, and the lessons she had learned from their shared past. She visited his grave, not with bitterness or resentment, but with a quiet acceptance, a forgiveness that had finally set her free. Jedediah and his men disappeared, fading back into the anonymity of the frontier. Josie never saw them again, but she often wondered about them, about the choices they had made, the lives they led. She hoped that they, too, had found some measure of peace, some redemption from the violence and the darkness that had consumed them. The boarding house in Harmony Springs became a distant memory, but Josie never forgot the kindness of the landlady, the sanctuary she had offered her in a time of need. She visited her often, bringing her gifts from the ranch, sharing stories of her new life, her happiness with Rhett. As the years turned into decades, Josie and Rhett built a life filled with love, laughter, and the simple joys of the frontier. They raised a family, their children growing up strong and resilient, inheriting their parents' courage, their compassion, and their unwavering commitment to each other. They grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond unbreakable, their hearts forever intertwined. They watched the sunsets paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. They listened to the wind whisper through the prairie grass. They held each other close, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. They had found their peace, their home, their forever, in the heart of the Wild West. The end.